If there's one thing you take away from this video, it's this. Mauga is one of the few tanks in the game where your sustain is directly linked to the amount of damage you deal. You need to be paying attention to your armor because you're basically unkillable with it during your cardiac overdrive. You also need to be paying attention to your bullets, otherwise you're gonna run out of ammo, be stuck in a long animation, and not get your passive sustain up. Baiting with pins is also a key idea. You can cancel your pin to stop a bad engage, and don't forget you can disengage with it too. Lastly, cage isn't complicated, just walk up and cage to split their front line, or if you catch a squishy, you can burn them in the cage too. Mauga's gun, the B-Tech TF2 heavy minigun.
It costs $400,000 to fire this weapon for 12 seconds.
Makes Mauga fire either his incendiary chain gun, which ignites enemies on fire for 15 DPS for 4 seconds, or his volatile chain gun, which deals crit damage to enemies on fire. They both deal 4 damage per bullet, dealing 72 DPS each, reducing your movement speed by 15%. They can also be fired together for double the DPS, but the guns have a lot of spread and your move speed is reduced by 30%. This would also be a good time to bring up your Berserker passive, where Mauga converts 50% of all critical damage as overhealth. This is extremely obvious advice, but I need to bring it up in case new players are watching this. In pretty much all scenarios, you want to light enemies on fire with your incendiary chain gun, then use your other chain gun when they're on fire. Super basic stuff. Now into the more interesting micro. The first part hasn't even got to do with your gun, but your HP. The armor you have on Mauga is super valuable because it drastically reduces the rate at which you take damage. And the biggest mistake I see most Mauga players make is engaging without armor. Take this example from a Grandmaster Mauga player who you'll recognize if you watched my Brig video. In this case, the Mauga engages because he thinks he can punish the Brig, but he's not paying attention to his lack of armor. This means that over time, even with cardiac overdrive, he'll lose the sustain game and you'll end up dying for it. The penultimate thing I want to touch on with your chain guns is actually target priority. Because of Mauga's hero design, you kinda need to be shooting the enemy tank to keep your sustain up. But there is a little bit of nuance here. If you see a killable target, like an overextending Brig, especially if other players are shooting that Brig, switching target can be a valid thing to do. And lastly, I want to touch on your reloads. Mauga has, I'm pretty sure, the longest reload at the game at 2.2 seconds, and since you gain overhealth from crit damage, the last thing you want to happen is to be busy reloading while you're in the fights. Just simply reload before you're about to go in, and generally speaking, just look at the bottom half of your screen so you can check your HP and ammo counts. Mauga's first ability...
Guys, we gotta come up with another plan. They got a tank.
Makes Mauga charge at the enemy team with a 50% damage reduction. His max charge range is about 28 meters, and you can also do a stomp that deals 150 damage on the inner radius or 75 on the outer radius. You also get 30 damage if you collide into someone while stomping, and the cooldown is 5 seconds. Do note that this ability is very overtuned at the moment, so don't be shocked if the numbers change from this video. Now there's 2 main uses to your stomp or pin, as some people like to call it, to either hard engage or soft engage. Hard engaging or hard stomping is what you'd normally think of. Stomping on one or more targets, getting that massive damage off, and basically one-shotting the enemy team. Soft stomping is a lot more subtle though. Most commonly, this will be running, but cancelling your pin somewhere in the middle to a piece of cover, or running through the enemy team, and instead of committing, you end your stomp back to your own team. So when do you do which pin? Well, hard stomps require certain triggers or advantages to be in your favour. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know what the triggers are, but basically, they can be HP, cooldown, positional, ultimate, or numbers based. HP, which we talked about in the last section, refers to how much HP not only you have, but the enemies have as well. If they themselves are low, then that can give a sign to maybe stomp in. Cooldowns can also be a trigger. If the enemy Ana doesn't have sleep dart or nade, then that can be an opening to go in. Same thing with ultimates too if you've got cage. Positional triggers can refer to punishing bad enemy positioning, or if your team has especially good positioning, like your DPS being set up on good angles. And lastly, numbers generally refer to how many people are alive. For example, you're more likely to hard engage in a 5v3 compared to a 5v5, but numbers can also refer to how many people are engaging with you. If a Genji and Venture are diving with you onto a single Baptiste, then that's technically a 3v1. Here's a great example of that from Smurf. Somehow, Fielder hits a sleep dart onto Ghost. This gives Smurf a trigger to engage because he now has a massive positional advantage because the Baptiste is stationary, a numbers advantage because the Baptiste is basically AFK, and a HP advantage since he's full HP when he stomps on Ghost. Here's a more recent example from Hanbin in the recent Stockholm finals. You can see his team pinging the Brigitte, who's playing close enough, so that's a positional trigger. He also has his Cage, so an ultimate trigger, and his Reaper is going in, so a numbers trigger. With that now out the way, when do you soft engage and why? Well, you typically soft engage when there's small advantages that you still want to push, but not enough of an advantage that allows you to hard engage. And in terms of why they're good, soft engaging does two things. It creates space and diverts attention because people don't want to get stomped, so they'll be looking at you. Secondly, it allows the rest of your team, especially your DPS, to walk up and take space precisely because they're looking at you. Here's an example that I go through from a coaching session that I had with a Grandmaster Mauga. Yeah, what's the issue with this?
I fucked up. I fucked up so hard. Got the ass out of position, tried to make a play, and then she coach guns away. And then Sarah has another bubble for the backline, and they have an Ana. It's just like bad play.
So like literally in that like sentence there, you mentioned the Ana, which is like a numbers thing because the Ana can still help the Ashe. You mentioned the Zarya as well, so that's a cooldown related thing because she still has bubble. There's also a positional thing going on here because while the Ashe is kind of split, she's not really that split. Like the Kiriko can still help her, the Zarya can still help the Ashe, the Ana can still help the Ashe by backing off and you know, healing off from behind, all that kind of stuff there. So like the key thing to understand is that there's no trigger for this. If the Ashe was like 1 HP and you knew the Kiriko didn't have Suzu, or you knew the Ashe didn't have Coach Gun, then maybe I could see this working out. But that being said, the Stomp itself isn't terrible, because what you should have done is cancel it here. You literally get out a bubble here for free, you LOS the Ashe, you LOS the Kiriko, you end the Stomp here, and then you can pop a Cardiac Overdrive if you want to, and then melt the Zarya after she's popped this bubble.
I've never thought about the cans, like, to force bubbles. That's something I've never really thought about, actually.
Mauga's second ability, the worst designed ability in Overwatch, makes Mauga take 40% less damage, and 100% of the damage you deal, you get back as healing for 3 seconds. The effects are halved for teammates, and the cooldown is 12 seconds. Honestly, this ability functions pretty closely to Fortify, with the added quirk that teammates can get benefit from it too. Just like Fortify, there's 2 main uses: defensive or aggressive. A defensive example is the obvious one. You'll stomp in, either miss or hit the stomp, and you'll pop Cardiac Overdrive to absorb the damage you take on entry. In other words, it kind of functions like an oh shit button. Now in terms of aggressive uses, they tend to be a bit more nuanced. There's a massive misconception that people think you can't use Cardiac Overdrive first, and you should save it later in the fights. If you see triggers to get value out of it now, then using it is very reasonable. In this example, in the literal first fight of the Stockholm finals, you can see that as soon as the Reaper comes into frame, Hamden pops the Cardiac Overdrive to aggress onto Junbin. The extra sustain that the Mauga and Reaper gets means that Junbin gets his HP pretty low, giving Team Falcons a massive edge in this fight. Barring that, it is important to note that you can still die in Cardiac Overdrive, especially if you don't have any armor. Just to do some math, if you fire both Chainguns while in Cardiac Overdrive, considering one of your guns will be getting guaranteed crits, you'll be dealing 216 DPS. That's 216 HPS in Cardiac Overdrive, and add your armor, you're basically getting a 3-second Transcendence on cooldown. Mauga's ultimate, 2 chains, makes Mauga deploy a 1500 HP barrier with a 7 meter radius that locks in himself and enemies. The barrier has an 8-second duration, and you can cancel it anytime. Thankfully, the way you use Cage isn't that different from how it was on release. The most obvious solo queue way of using Cage is to just force an advantageous duel with characters that don't want to fight you up close. In particular, people like Hanzo, Widow, Iliari, Soldier do not want to be in your cage, and squishy tanks like Doomfist, Queen, or a Zarya without bubbles also don't want to be in your cage. However, in the recent Mauga mirrors that we've been seeing, these options aren't always available to you. Still, Cage isn't that hard to use. In these cases, you want to isolate the front line, basically splitting the tank or a specific hero from the rest of their entire team. In this example, you can see Hanbin cage Junbin when he stomps quite deep, isolating Junbin for a decent period of time and winning that HP trade. However, you don't have to just isolate Mauga. You can cage a Brig, for example, who's pushed up quite far. What I will say is what you don't want happening is to cage the entire enemy team, because then you become isolated yourself. Cage is all about isolation and forcing a clear numbers advantage onto the enemy team, creating a 5v3 instead of a 1v5. Lastly, building off that point, I want to talk about cage cancels. It's not that complex, but if you're getting overwhelmed in your cage, you need to cancel it and leave. Christopher, former head coach for SSG, talked about this briefly in the most recent episode of Uncoachable. I'll play the example he talks about afterwards.
Watch one of the matches. The one I watched was Falcons versus Nightmare. That was the one I watched. Like, there was this one fight where Infected intentionally caged, and they did the tech where you break the cage when the enemy beams, because you don't want to fight in cage against beam, but if you trade cage for beam, it's considered a win.
Cage, take a look at where Infected is standing. He's so excited to pop this.
That's a 3-person cage. Just end up charging away though.
Now onto Mauga's positioning and playstyle. With positioning by far underway, the most important aspect with not just Mauga, but ground tanks that don't have shields, is pathing. For example, you can see here that Smurf decides to path on the low ground to the left instead of on point, because he'll take way too much damage on main. This allows him to get a good engage on top of the Cassidy, and he enters with pretty much full HP. This does lead me onto playstyle, and while I do have a complete brawl guide, I will briefly cover the different Mauga playstyles. The first is just burning frontline. Of course, you'll be doing this generally to get your HP back, but this is especially good to do against weak frontline tanks like Doomfist or Winston, who, if you burn early on, they'll be forced to give up space. However, it's important to not get tunnel vision on these targets and to know when to switch playstyles throughout. The second is diving or dueling squishies. In this game that I've been using throughout, from Falcons and Ents, we see Falcons pretty much try their best to always get on top of Ent's backline. This is because Ents on the whole have significantly more ranged pressure, and Kevster can just mark the Hanzo if he needs to. In other words, if Smurf sits main, shooting the Sigma, he will certainly lose. As a result, he and his team will look to skirmish for those triggers talked about earlier to be able to hard engage on the backline. Whether that be landing lucky sleep darts, or a big ult combo, or just getting a big positional advantage, those are all key to reaching the backline. The third is baiting. This is just stomping away and absorbing the enemy team's engagements. This might sound obvious, but there's one very subtle but important tip to be able to pull this off. In this example, Hardy walks forward with Hypering, but look at how far Hardy swings away from the corner. This gives him distance away from Infected, which allows him to safely stomp away. Honestly, this fight would have been won had SSG just not blown their Juno ult the last fight, but the principle of baiting around a corner with distance still stands. Now onto Mauga's tank matchups. Mauga vs D.Va. In the past, this matchup used to be a lot more equal, but now it obviously favors D.Va. She can eat the whole of your cardiac overdrive, fly away to high grounds that you can never reach, and half the damage you do thanks to her armor. So what do? Well, most of the time, it's either going to be stomping and running the D.Va over, or doing that bait playstyle to force the D.Va to fly away, or looking to dive for a backline with Stomp. The boosters here are the important thing, as they're the cooldown that can give you a trigger to do either of those playstyles. Mauga vs Doomfist. Not a complex matchup, just melt him in the pre-fight, force him to leave his power block by threatening with your Stomp, and solo cage him when he doesn't have punch. Mauga vs Hazards. Now, you'll probably be watching this video when Hazard releases, but thankfully, I talked to Tier 2 professional coach Cuffy to understand how Hazard works. Without giving too much away, he basically told me that Hazard functions like D.Va in that both heroes can do everything. And considering Hazard doesn't have an ability that just eats your overdrive, it seems fair to assume that you can burn Hazard more easily compared to D.Va. You can also stomp his block too, or force it out just by fake stomping. The only major concern for me is that good Hazard players will try to avoid you at all costs. So if you're able to burn him early on, likewise to Doomfist, or stomp him whenever he tries to go in, he'll certainly struggle. Mauga vs Queen. Typically, this matchup is worse for you, as Queen's hitbox is much smaller than yours. She'll also be looking to bait you to walk through long distances and open space. The key to beating Queen is to clear out any angles her team is holding by using those soft pins that we talked about earlier. Here's an example from Tier 2 Coach Capitology, and the full video will be in the description.
You need to abuse your neutral. Walk up, use your CDs if you have to, use our Mauga pin to do something like this, right? Like I want to pin to maybe an area like this where backline backs up and I clear their bait, right? And when I say clear, I mean like acknowledge that this team is baiting and make them honestly bait, right? They're not baiting from here. I'm going to threaten that engage, really like pump fake them, you know? Then they'll back up. Then I can 5-man shoot the queen. And if backline doesn't walk up for their queen, we will kill their queen, right? So they have to walk up, or queen just has to leave, right? If queen leaves, I chase. If backline walks up, I kill them all here in this area, right? And that's my kind of third turn style where I'm playing for a mid-fight engage based on pump faking this bait, right? And clearing these people.
Mauga vs Orisa. Orisa is one of the few tanks who are very hard to burn because her Fortify counters your Overdrive. So, the main way you'll beat her is literally by stomping past her entirely and inting onto her backline, which honestly is probably how Orisa fell so quickly out of the meta. Mauga vs Ramatra. Generally in Mauga's favour, since Ram can't do much against your miniguns except block. One thing I will say is to not tunnel on the Ram when he's blocking because of the damage mitigation. You'll do close to no damage, which means you'll get close to no healing. In cases like these, it can be useful to force the Ram form, then wait until it's finished, then walk or stomp in, and Ram can't do much about it. Mauga vs Reinhardt. People often think that this matchup favours Mauga, but actually, it's pretty decent for Reinhardt. Ryan can shield off your Overdrive, meaning you get no healing, and his shield allows him to rotate through open space, unlike you. There's this infamous clip by Hardy, who outplays a Mauga by keeping as much distance as possible to make it painful for the Mauga to walk up. So what do you do in this situation? Well, soft pins are very useful. In that Lijiang example, maybe soft pinning to the piece of cover, waiting for cooldowns, then pinning around the Reinhardt can be a nice way to bypass him. Mauga vs Hog. Generally a favourable matchup for Mauga. His whole hog does kinda counter your cage fights, so do be wary of that, but barring that exception, you kinda shred Hog. His healing and damage mitigation is much more limited compared to Ramatra, and he's got no armor, meaning you get free HP. Just be careful to not get baited by his hook, either off the map or deep in the enemy team, otherwise you'll likely die. Mauga vs Sigma. We've seen this matchup a fair amount in pro play, and it almost always works out the same. Sigma wants to prevent you from getting on top of his backline with the amount of poke he has, and he wants to absorb your engage by rocking you and grasping your cardiac overdrive. In examples like these, pathing and gaining triggers by soft engaging becomes super important. In rare cases, if you've got a Mei, you can just run over the Sigma. Mauga vs Winston. This one is super map dependent because on vertical maps, if you're playing against Winston Ana, it's super difficult to outplay the Winston, but on horizontal maps, it usually becomes much easier. The big choice you have to make is whether to burn the Winston or zone the backline. And considering you're not great at zoning, burning the Winston and trying to stomp him when he goes in is generally the best idea. That is unless the enemy backline are hard feeding. Mauga vs Ball. It's kinda similar to Winston, so I won't spend too much time on it. Thankfully, Ball hasn't got a shield that nullifies your overdrive, but he can avoid you somewhat easily. Just burn the Ball when you can, and zone or dive his backline if he's completely inaccessible. Mauga vs Zarya. I've pretty much got an entire coaching session dedicated to dealing with this matchup, so I recommend to watch that. But in short, you really need to track and bait bubbles before you can do anything. Without bubbles, so getting her to walk in open space or baiting her with soft pins can all help get bubbles out of Zarya. You can also just cage her grav, which is something that I've seen Infected do in ranked games. And that's it for the complete Mauga guides. As always, if you enjoyed, if this video helped to raise your IQ, be sure to share it with your friends to also raise theirs. Until next time.